So I have a bit of a complicated or involved relationship with Eastern Europe. I used to speak fairly good Russian. It's not the greatest these days. I've had a 4-year hiatus, and now I'm having a trial by fire, getting back into it. I've spent some time in Ukraine. I currently live in Moscow, of all places. In my graduate work, I had some courses on Russian history, things like that. So got some connections there. Also have a lot of friends from Eastern Europe, just Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, places like that. I've gotten to know a fair number of people who are Orthodox out of that. I've also, with some of the seminary classes and all that, kind of started some interest in looking into that and trying to find out more about it, looking into the history, kind of hand in hand with just looking at the church history and stuff like that. So I'm not an expert, but way more familiar than the average Westerner. So something that came to my mind a few months ago, at least, and that's just kind of in the back of my head that I want to at least address, is generally the idea that for the Protestant apologetics community, Orthodoxy is going to be a big thing in the future. If you're for the people trying to debate it and stuff like that, it's going to be a big problem. And I don't think Protestantism's really come to terms with that, especially not maybe the Reformed world. What kind of kickstarted this thinking was my wife had come across some video where James White was talking about Orthodoxy, and then also a video from Right Response Ministries a while back where he was giving his reasons why Orthodoxy was wrong. And the James White one just jumped at me because it was I've tried to look into some of this stuff, but it's so weird, and it's just a different way of thinking and all. Some people need to really spend some time studying it so we can debunk it or disprove it. It didn't seem like the most productive approach to have, to kind of just say, don't understand it, but got to prove it wrong. Probably understand it and then figure out what of it's wrong you need to disprove or not. With Right Response Ministries stuff, I appreciate what he does. Nothing against these people, but still, whatever the video was, it was cringy bad, because it's you kind of spend a little bit of time doing a crash course, maybe read one book on it, and you don't actually know anything, because the foundational worldviews and ways of looking at everything are so different. The ways they're looking at the words are different. How they interpret everything are different. It is a different world from the Protestantism. James White, when he said that, he got that part very right. But with the Right Response, it was almost kind of this attitude. It's I just jumped into it, did some study on it, and now I'm just going to weigh in on how it's bad. Doug Wilson's had some stuff like that too. It's just oh man, you've not really thought through any of this in any detail. Trying to unpack the differences in worldview, even just the differences in how they look at different words and things like that, so that we'll look at what something church father says, some metropolite, something he'll say, and we'll have a cow over it. And then you unpack what he was actually meaning in context, and it's just not the same thing. Traditional, especially the Reformed world, but also evangelicalism as a whole is going to have a bit of a smash or a bit of a crash, and is just not ready for it, not thinking necessarily clearly. I don't think the Protestant world realizes how much Protestant identity is tied with being the opposite of Catholic. Just don't be Catholic. A member of my family was pointing out, and other people pointed out to me, and I just kind of went and did the digging on it. I was well, they call them priests in the Orthodox Church, and that's just wrong, because the Old Testament priesthood went away, so that can't be it. And so that's part of this horrible system. Yeah, but the English word priest, if you follow the chain of where the word comes from, eventually comes back to presbyteros, the Greek word for elder. And the people taking issue with this are Reformed Baptists who have elders in their churches, or Presbyterians who have elders in their churches, and they call them elders. The point being, it's almost kind of there's just this assumption, right? I'm Catholic, it's called priest, therefore it must be evil, it's wrong, and we went the opposite way, and then we kind of just apply that over to everything, right? The Orthodox had priest, it must be priest in the same way we have problems with it, and it's not, but we assume it is. I had a talk with a friend recently who's Orthodox, and his priest, he was saying, it's really weird talking to Protestants. It's they come in assuming that, all these things are Catholic or something like that, and they just can't get it. And my friend, who was a former Protestant who had become Orthodox, told him that, when it gets down to it, so much of Protestantism, we just automatically think in terms of it, of responding to Catholicism, and that's very true. If Catholicism's like a pendulum that swung way out there from where Christianity should have been into heresy, Protestantism was the reaction. It swung the pendulum the other way. Having a disdain for church history, the church fathers, things like that just props up in evangelicalism, all this stuff. There's so much stuff that almost seems to be almost kind of this extreme reaction against anything that looks Catholic. Okay, where am I getting at with this? For one, we interpret everything in light of Catholicism. Orthodox have priests, well, therefore their communion must be a re-sacrificing, and all the issues we have with Catholicism is therefore bad. They foundationally do not look at what their priest is doing in anything like the same light that a Catholic priest does. When a Protestant comes along having a fit with transubstantiation or something like that, all the air just kind of comes out of that balloon when you try to object to Orthodoxy, and they find out, well, they don't believe it the same way because they just don't have those same Aristotelian categories of thinking. That just was never a thing in the East. So that whole Catholic philosophical system that gets you to transubstantiation just didn't exist. So they just don't even think in the same terminology, or they don't even think about it in the same way. A lot of Protestantism defines itself so much as being in opposition to Catholicism. The Catholics are high church with liturgy. Protestantism almost has this reaction of high church, Catholics high church, okay, low church, just swing that low church. So you see something that has the smells and bells, as we would say, and the assumption is it's got to be Catholic. There's no sitting and engaging with the philosophy, with the theology, with the history. It's just kind of this extreme swing back at it. And so this is where I think there's almost this kind of, I'm not trying to sound woke, but this sort of bigotry of, it looks Catholic, therefore I'm just going to write it off as Catholic, and I'm not going to bother to engage with it. I think it was James White who had that thing on there. It's just so hard to wrap your head around all this other stuff. And I just remember thinking, it's like, you studied Arabic just to be able to engage with Muslims. This is way easier. Like, there's way more translations of the Church Fathers, and you're already a Greek scholar. It would take less time to start getting a feel for the Orthodox worldview than it would to learn Arabic. I'm just saying, but Protestants don't seem to ever really be interested in doing this. And I'm not trying to pick on James White. He does great things and all that. I don't mean to be attributing motives and things like that. He's a busy guy. I'm just saying I see this kind of response a lot. This kind of like, didn't make sense to me. It's all Catholic anyway. It's like, it's not, though. Protestantism is more similar to Catholicism than Orthodoxy is to Catholicism. Because Protestantism, even though it's this radical reaction against Catholicism, it comes from the same medieval world of Western Europe, and it's built on the same original worldview and ways of thinking. So like salvation, for example, the whole fighting in the West, really, when it comes down to the Reformation, is all just a big fight over soteriology. You got to figure out how you're saved. The whole thing in the West is, we say the Western Roman Empire has the influence of sort of a Roman system of thinking about jurisprudence. So everything is thought of in terms of law. The salvation process is thought of God as the judge, and this is being a law court. Everything is thought in these terms. So Protestantism thinks in those terms. I'm sorry, you start unwrapping the doctrines of grace if you're a Reformed person, it's all courtroom thinking. Now, I'm not saying this doesn't exist in Orthodoxy, but the primary thinking is more the Christus Victor, looking at Christ as the grand champion who overthrew sin, and he's the great healer, and you're trying to have union with him who's overcome death and sin. It's a completely different way of imagining the whole process. As a result, when it gets into like a Protestant's objections to Catholicism, if you try to use those against Orthodoxy, they will bounce off because they're not relevant. They just don't even attach to how an Orthodox person thinks about the church, theology, any of this stuff. And so therefore, when you have this sort of radical, strong anti-Catholicism, but at the same time, no ability to distinguish and say, but they're not Catholic, you run into this problem to where you can't deal with their point of view. You can't even engage with it. You just talk past each other. You have to actually start learning the worldview, or else the conversations, they don't even make sense. You could speak the same language, but the words go right past each other. And then there's a few different problems here that I foresee. One, they're going to go at it with the same level of animosity as against Catholicism, which, for my 2 cents, I think is not warranted. A Reformed person has quite radical differences with a Pentecostal, with a Reformed Anglican, with a Lutheran, but we'll also say, yeah, but they're still Christians. Well, what's the common denominator? Well, we all didn't like Rome. I mean, there's a kind of a point at which you're going to have to say, couldn't we extend at least some grace to the original people who didn't like the papacy? So anyway, my point being, though, is there's going to be that same level of animosity without being able to say, oh, there's more to it than just putting it over on the same stuff. So in the first place, you're going to have an animosity that I think is overblown. In the second place, your objections to their positions just are not going to stick. You're going to have your objections to Catholicism because of how they put works in salvation, and then you stick it onto Orthodoxy, and it won't stick. It just kind of slides off because they don't think about it the same way. And believe me, I've had discussions with Orthodox. It's like, it doesn't stick the same way. It just doesn't. And so this is going to be kind of a catastrophe if you have a lot of these Protestant-type people going and trying to have their debates kind of just blowing it off. Because this was the thing that just was terrible with, I want to say it was the Right Response Ministries video. I can't remember. There were several. There was an OPC guy that also had a bunch of videos that he was trying to go from church history to debunk them. And it was like, these videos, I could look at them and go, I see how you think you're answering them. This is not going to work on an Orthodox person to convince them. And if you tell a Protestant these things about Orthodoxy, and then that person turns around, so in this scenario, the pastor gives you the YouTube videos here about Orthodoxy and everything that's wrong with it, gives them to one of their congregants, and then that congregant turns around and goes and meets someone who's Orthodox, who takes them off to their priest to have a talk, you're going to make that person way more likely to become Orthodox. Because you gave your version of what they think, then they're going to go off and meet a real Orthodox person. They're going to be like, how did he get there? Because the assumptions are so different. I think it was the Right Response Ministries one that it was kind of like he's breaking it down in terms of sort of a Western conception of salvation, all that, to point out the issues here. And then they're going to go off to the Orthodox guy and be like, yeah, we don't even think about it that way. And it's just going to feel like it all kind of just dissolves and the problems are not going to work anymore. And then you're going to feel a little bit like you were lied to. I'm just going to be honest, that's what it's going to end up being like. And so I think in a weird sort of way, it's like if these apologists don't want to be sending their people away, they need to bother, put in the effort to engage, put in the effort to figure out that worldview. Now, of course, the danger in that I think a lot of people, because they're so opposed to Catholicism, and anything that looks like Catholicism then gets lumped in with that same kind of just revulsion. The problem with that I'll be honest, I found myself in that same place. Is the more you engage with it, the more you're kind of like, these differences are way more toned down than with Catholicism when you get into actually unpacking the worldview and a lot of this stuff. And a lot of the foundational issues with Catholicism are just outright gone, or they're issues that you have in common with an Orthodox person. And so there's kind of this darned if you do, darned if you don't thing, where it's like you engage with it, and then you kind of risk having to sit there and deal with the question of, are they as different as they thought they were? That's one. Because a big piece of their identity and history was dealing with what they would consider the Roman heresy, dealing with the papacy, trying to exalt itself over the church, and answering back against that and standing firm and saying, no. I'm going to be honest, that's probably the most foundational piece of Lutheran or just overall Protestant identity is that right there anyway. So anyway, those things are all what I foresee as just major issues, is people literally are so out of connection with the foundational worldview that they put together these videos, and I watch them and I'm like screaming, ready to pull my hair out, because they're so badly don't even know what they don't know. It's just like that when I see a lot of the material that's being put out against. It's like they don't get the worldview at all, and it almost feels like laziness. It's just like, take some time to figure it out. The next big thing for why Orthodoxy is going to be a big challenge for the Protestant apologetics types is I think it's going to keep speeding up its growth. A while back, it wasn't on any Protestant person's radar. It just wasn't at all. At this point, having been raised in the Protestant bubble, I still know multiple people who've converted, looking at converting. It has exploded. And I'm just going to be honest, Protestants are complacent and being lazy on this one. If they want to keep their congregations, they're being lazy as all get out. Because even in the U.S., even in the Southeast, we're talking the Carolinas, not a hot spot for Orthodoxy. I already could tell. I knew of people who were looking into it. I knew of churches around. I knew of them growing. And people, even the types of ministers and all who are into apologetics and all they, once again, I'm kind of recycling the same point. They just kept repeating the doctrines of grace kind of stuff. And it was just kind of, and I'm just sitting here going, it's like, you're arguing with an opponent, with a different opponent, an opponent that doesn't exist. The worldviews are radically different. You can't use the same arguments you use for an atheist on a Hindu. That just doesn't work. And then the follow-up thing would be the fact that there's the complacency of thinking that the call for church unity is not important. I've met tons of people who are just, they're looking at how postmodernism is hollowing out Western society, and they want something to hold on to, something that's built in history, that has roots, and feels like it doesn't change. And this is paradoxically why I think a lot of Protestants are wandering into the Catholic Church, which shows that they're not doing their homework, because the Catholic Church is going woke faster than snow melts in the Sahara. But we had some friends who went to Catholicism, and I was ready to pull my hair out. It's like, how are you ignoring all the stuff that's happening with the Pope? But my point being, though, is a lot of people in the middle of Western society melting down and postmodernism just tearing a hole through our ability to deal with any sort of transcendent truth, critical theory, trying to tear up our sense of history, rewrite history, all these things. People are wanting to hang on to something that gives them a basis for unity, church unity, and history. And I'm sorry, but I've lived in the Reformed world my whole life. I have been a member of some sort of Presbyterian church my whole life, but I've also traveled a lot, so I've spent time attending Baptist churches. I almost feel like it gets blown off. If someone comes along, that person who's kind of having that pull towards whatever, like Catholicism or something, right? They're like, I want some sort of sense of church unity in a through thread. It gets blown off. It gets treated as though that doesn't matter. And then you sit here and kind of go, when Christ left the disciples to ascend up into heaven, he tells them to be unified. There's something important about that. There is something foundationally important about that. The Protestant Reformation killed itself right out the gate by not seeming to be able to hammer out a really consistent system of church unity. I know the default answers will flood in about the universal church, what doctrines are tertiary, what things are tertiary, what things are salvation issues, gospel issues, whatever. I don't care. Stop kidding yourself. We wouldn't have this many denominations. Shall we say the magisterial reformers, the heavy hitters, if they had actually hammered out something that was really viable, we wouldn't have as many denominations as you do. You're always going to have heresy, so you would have a few denominations, but you wouldn't have what you have now. And I hear people voice that, and it just kind of gets blown off. You'll have the whole, I want unity. And be like, well, if you go to a Reformed Baptist church and then go to a Presbyterian church, it feels pretty much the same. They'll split on a dime over something. No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. You might be able to find the answer in church history. You might be able to find the answer in saying there is a thread that ties us all together. So even the church fathers, even though they didn't understand things quite the same as the modern reformers, there's still kind of a through line of faith and people living in faith, all these kind of things. You might be able to find that answer in there. You're not going to find it by just blowing it off when people state it or just be like, well, you got the scripture. Yeah, Joseph Smith had a Bible too, and look where that went. You can't just blow off that people are feeling that way. And I'm saying this as a cautionary tale, having seen some friends of ours who were struggling with looking into Catholicism, voiced it to their Reformed minister, who kind of just blew up over it. Kind of, to a certain extent, I get the impression, now admittedly there's some he said, she said, because I heard it from multiple sides of this thing, but I still get the impression that there was basically a lack of ability to actually seriously consider their needs and what they were struggling with. And that, I think, ended up leading this couple into something really terrible, I think. And this is where we have to be realistic with how we deal with the problems going on. The need for some sort of sense of church unity and connection to the past has to be dealt with. When it gets down to it, let's be honest, a lot of times for a person who grew up in a Protestant church, the first time that they've heard anything about church history prior to 1517 is when they're going to meet that Catholic apologist or that Orthodox person. And when they meet that Orthodox person who comes along and and can tell them about, how they should have pride in the church fathers and the accomplishments of the past, it's going to be hard for them to not go, wow, this is the first person I met, someone who actually loves the history of Christ's church, other than just our little group of the Reformers in the grand scheme of church history. If you don't want everyone to be running off as some sort of apologist, you need to be doing a better job at helping people to find some sort of appreciation for their history. That's that second point. And I'm just going to be honest here. As the Catholic Church goes more woke, Orthodoxy, I do think, will be that thing. Because I think a lot of people are obviously flowing out of Catholicism and into Orthodoxy. I met a gentleman just yesterday. He was like 60 years old, lifetime Catholic from Ireland. He's in Russia now. He basically, it seems like he woke up one day, it was just kind of like, the wokeness of the papacy, this has got to go. And then looks around and says, yeah, there's a Christianity out there that's also just as old, just as built, just as tied to the apostles and the ancient church, and it doesn't have this papal heresy in it. I'm going there. And I think his story is going to be the story of a lot of people. I don't foresee Orthodoxy being this thing that's just going to pop up and disappear. If anything, I think it's going to keep growing. I could imagine a world in which we fast forward a few centuries and the big kind of main divisions of Christianity aren't Catholicism and Protestantism. They're Orthodoxy and whatever Protestantism's morphed into right now. Based on the numbers, it's going to be some sort of weird evangelical Pentecostalism, because that's the stuff that's growing the fastest, with little outposts of Reformed stuff. But I don't see, with how the culture is breaking down, that it's going to slow down. And if anything, I think Orthodoxy will probably speed up, because it doesn't have the same problems that Catholicism has, aka a woke pope, or really being bogged down with the canon law type thinking of Catholicism, to where the Pope has been speaking ex cathedra and you have to try and make all these past declarations be absolutely true, even though you've had anti-popes, even though you had the Western Schism where you have a council establish that, basically remove the multiple popes who are already popes to set up a new line of popes. You don't have to deal with all these weird contradictions in the history in the same way. So Orthodoxy will end up looking like a stronger thing anyway to people just trying to balance out which of the two are better. And then on top of that, it doesn't have all this modern wokeism to the same degree. Obviously, every church is going to be getting infected by this stuff a bit, but it's definitely not to the same degree. I think, to be honest, I don't mean to sound like a jerk, but I think a lot of Protestants need to stop being so lazy and maybe legitimately ask themselves whether or not they're writing off Orthodoxy as an enemy, where maybe there's some bridges that could actually be built instead of just writing them off as Catholics, to be completely honest here. Are there major areas of difference? As my last disclaimer, oh yeah, they're huge issues. They're like huge areas of difference. I'm not saying that you get into studying it and all of a sudden it becomes like, they're in perfect alignment. I'm just saying a lot of the big things that we have against Catholicism aren't there. And in the Protestant world, we give a lot of grace to people for just kind of, let's be honest, sharing the same heritage of being opposed to Catholicism. And so the logical question to me is, why can't we at least share some of that grace to the original people who were against Catholicism, as I had mentioned earlier? Anyway, this is my ramblings for today. I hope you all enjoyed, and have a good one.